I've spent 2 episodes talking about the first stave, Marley's Ghost, and now it is time to begin the second stave, the first of the three spirits. If you've only seen adaptations of the story and not read the book, you might be surprised at a few of the things in here. It's one of the most influential books ever written. Even if you've never read Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, you are familiar with it. My name is Collin, and I've loved this story for as long as I can remember. I'm going to be taking a look at all of the movie and TV adaptations of A Christmas Carol that I can, because I love the story that much. This is Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. A Christmas Carol deep dive, the first of the three spirits. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, the audiobook I use is from LibriVox, a wonderful free source that adapts public domain works with great narrators, and all of their audiobooks are also in the public domain, so you are free to use them in any context. Check out their website. There is plenty to listen to and enjoy there. I will hand it back over to Kyle Munley and Stave 2 of A Christmas Carol, and I'll be back in with notes, points about adaptations, historical context, and more.
Stave 2 of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Stave 2, the first of the three spirits. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of bed he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber. He was endeavoring to pierce the darkness with his ferret eyes when the chimes of a neighboring church struck the 4 quarters, so he listened for the hour. To his great astonishment, the heavy bell went on from 6 to 7, and from 7 to 8, and regularly up to 12, then stopped. 12! It was past 2 when he went to bed. The clock was wrong. An icicle must have got into the works. 12! He touched the spring of his repeater to correct this most preposterous clock. Its rapid little pulse beat 12, and stopped.
Repeater was a feature on a clock or watch that, before light bulbs, could tell you the time in the dark by the number of vibrations it made.
"Why, it is impossible," said Scrooge, "that I can have slept through a whole day and far into another night. It is impossible that anything has happened to the sun, and this is 12 at noon." The idea being an alarming one, he scrambled out of bed and groped his way to the window. He was obliged to rub the frost off with the sleeve of his dressing-gown before he could see anything, and could see very little then. All he could make out was that it was still very foggy and extremely cold, and that there was no noise of people running to and fro and making a great stir, as there unquestionably would have been if night had beaten off bright day and taken possession of the world. This was a great relief, because 3 days after sight of this first exchange pay to Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge or his order, and so forth, would have become a mere United States security if there were no days to count by.
In 1843, the United States economy was in a pretty bad place, as about 25% of banks had shut down, and prices had dropped 40%. Many states took much convincing to pay their debts to the federal government. This is why Charles Dickens uses a mere United States security as a phrase meaning worthless.
Scrooge went to bed again and thought, and thought, and thought it over and over and over, and could make nothing of it. The more he thought, the more perplexed he was, and the more he endeavored not to think, the more he thought. Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Every time he resolved within himself, after mature inquiry, that it was all a dream, his mind flew back again, like a strong spring released to its first position, and presented the same problem to be worked all through. Was it a dream or not? Scrooge lay in this state until the chime had gone 3/4 more, when he remembered, on a sudden, that the ghost had warned him of a visitation when the bell tolled 1. He resolved to lie awake until the hour had passed, and, considering that he could no more go to sleep than go to heaven, this was perhaps the wisest resolution in his power. The quarter was so long that he was more than once convinced he must have sunk into a doze unconsciously and missed the clock. At length it broke upon his listening ear. Ding-dong. "A quarter past," said Scrooge, counting. Ding-dong. "Half-past," said Scrooge. Ding-dong. "A quarter to it," said Scrooge. Ding-dong. "The hour itself," said Scrooge triumphantly, "and nothing else." He spoke before the hour bell sounded, which it did now with a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy 1. Light flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by a hand. Not the curtains at his feet, nor the curtains at his back, but those to which his face was addressed. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge, starting up into a half-recumbent attitude, found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew them. So close to it as I am to you now, and I am standing in the spirit at your elbow. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from the view, and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if its hold were of uncommon strength. Its legs and feet, most delicately formed, were, like those upper members, bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and, in singular contradiction of that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was, that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light, by which all this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, in its duller moments, a great extinguisher for a cap, which it now held under its arm. Even this, though, when Scrooge looked at it with increasing steadiness, was not its strangest quality, for as its belt sparkled and glittered now in one part and now in another, and what was light one instant, at another time was dark, so the figure itself fluctuated in its distinctness, being now a thing with one arm, now with one leg, now with 20 legs, now a pair of legs without a head, now a head without a body, of which dissolving parts no outline would be visible in the dense gloom wherein they melted away, and in the very wonder of this it would be itself again, distinct and clear as ever.
All right, so the description of this spirit is very complex, and it's really unlike any other descriptions in the book. It kind of feels like something out of a fever dream or even the biblical book of Revelation. I suppose those two are basically the same thing. Why does Dickens describe the ghost of Christmas past as ever changing and contradictory? Well, I tend to think it's because we can never see the past clearly. We may see little snippets here and there in our mind, but we can never look back on the past directly because we can't go back. Scrooge gets that opportunity here, but otherwise, the past never looks the same twice. Our memories are contradictory because they're just that, memories. All the contradictions in the ghost's description are no stranger than the contradictions we'd find if we tried to line up and fact check every memory we think we have. Anyone who's written a memoir will acknowledge this. Sometimes the past is clear in our minds, sometimes it's vague, usually it's somewhere in between, but it is always there in the back of our minds. When the past is the farthest away, in its duller moments, It wears an extinguisher, which is something that snuffs out a candle. Scrooge wants to shut out the light of the past by extinguishing the candle. Obviously, this description means that it is nearly impossible to adapt an accurate version of this ghost. What would one even look like? There are a few animated versions that do the changing faces thing, like the Richard Williams cartoon we've talked about, as well as the Robert Zemeckis film from 2009, but these are really few and far between. Some films go for an androgynous look with an ambiguous age, like the Patrick Stewart film, while others settle for simply showing the ghost giving off light, which is then snuffed out, like the Seymour Hicks film and the George C. Scott film. The ghosts of Christmas Present and Christmas Yet to Come have definitive looks, and if an adaptation doesn't go with those, the filmmakers are making a deliberate choice. With Christmas Past, pretty much anything goes. In addition to the challenging physical description, this also may have something to do with the fact that the original John Leech illustrations don't illustrate the ghost of Christmas Past either. All we see is Scrooge having completely covered the ghost with the extinguisher.
"Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me?" asked Scrooge. "I am." The voice was soft and gentle, singularly low, as if instead of being so close beside him, it were at a distance. "Who and what are you?" Scrooge demanded. "I am the ghost of Christmas Past." "Long past?" inquired Scrooge, observant of its dwarfish nature. "No, your past."
Human beings keep getting taller as generations go on, so Scrooge assumes this ghost is simply someone of average height from ages ago.
Perhaps Scrooge could not have told anybody why, if anybody could have asked him, but he had a special desire to see the spirit in his cap, and begged him to be covered. "What!" exclaimed the ghost. "Would you so soon put out with worldly hands the light I give? Is it not enough that you are one of those whose passions made this cap, and forced me through whole trains of years to wear it low upon my brow?"
This exchange appears to have a thematic connection to Marley's chains. Marley made his chains by living a selfish life where he never cared for others. This spirit has a cap that puts its light out because men like Scrooge have refused to learn from the past. They put the past's light out as well. And in Scrooge's case, it appears that he has refused to learn both from long past and, as we'll see, his own past.
Scrooge reverently disclaimed all intention to offend, or any knowledge of having wilfully bonneted the spirit at any period in his life. He then made bold to inquire what business brought him there. "Your welfare," said the ghost. Scrooge expressed himself much obliged, but could not help thinking that a night of unbroken rest would be more conducive to that end. The spirit must have heard him thinking, for it said immediately, "Your reclamation, then. Take heed." It put out its strong hand as it spoke, and clasped him gently by the arm. "Rise, and walk with me." It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, that bed was warm, and the thermometer a long way below freezing, that he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing-gown, and nightcap, and that he had a cold upon him at the time. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. He rose, but finding that the spirit made towards the window, clasped his robe in supplication. "I am mortal," Scrooge remonstrated, "and liable to fall." "Bear but a touch of my hand there," said the spirit, laying it upon his heart, "and you shall be upheld in more than this." As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall, and stood upon an open country road, with fields on either hand. The city had entirely vanished. Not a vestige of it was to be seen. The darkness and the mist had vanished with it, for it was a clear, cold winter day, with snow upon the ground. "Good heaven!" said Scrooge, clasping his hands together as he looked about him. "I was bred in this place. I was a boy here." The spirit gazed upon him mildly. Its gentle touch, though it had been light and instantaneous, appeared still present to the old man's sense of feeling. He was conscious of 1,000 odors floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts, and hopes, and joys, and cares long, long forgotten. "Your lip is trembling," said the ghost. "And what is that upon your cheek?" Scrooge muttered, with an unusual catching in his voice, that it was a pimple, and begged the ghost to lead him where he would. "You recollect the way?" inquired the spirit. "Remember it!" cried Scrooge with fervor. "I could walk it blindfold." "Strange to have forgotten it for so many years," observed the ghost. "Let us go on." They walked along the road, Scrooge recognizing every gate and post and tree, until a little market town appeared in the distance, with its bridge, its church, and winding river. Some shaggy ponies now were seen trotting towards them, with boys upon their backs, who called to other boys in country gigs and carts driven by farmers. All these boys were in great spirits, and shouted to each other until the broad fields were so full of merry music that the crisp air laughed to hear it. "These are but shadows of things that have been," said the ghost. "They have no consciousness of us." The jocund travellers came on, and, as they came, Scrooge knew and named them every one. Why was he rejoiced beyond all bounds to see them? Why did his cold eye glisten and his heart leap up as they went past? Why was he filled with gladness when he heard them give each other Merry Christmas as they parted at crossroads and byways for their several homes? What was Merry Christmas to Scrooge? Out upon Merry Christmas! What good had it ever done him? "The school is not quite deserted," said the ghost. "A solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still." Scrooge said he knew it, and he sobbed. They left the high road by a well-remembered lane, and soon approached a mansion of dull red brick, with a little weathercock-surmounted cupola on the roof, and a bell hanging in it. It was a large house, but one of broken fortunes, for its spacious offices were little used, their walls were damp and mossy, their windows broken, and their gates decayed. Fowls clucked and strutted in the stables, and the coach-houses and sheds were overrun with grass. Nor was it more retentive of its ancient state within, for entering the dreary hall and glancing through the open doors of many rooms, they found them poorly furnished, cold, and vast. There was an earthly savour in the air, a chilly bareness in the place, which associated itself somehow with too much getting up by candlelight, and not too much to eat. They went, the ghost and Scrooge, across the hall to a door at the back of the house. It opened before them, and disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room, made barer still by lines of plain deal forms and desks. At one of these, a lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge sat down upon a form and wept to see his poor forgotten self as he used to be. Not a latent echo in the house, not a squeak and scuffle from the mice behind the panelling, not a drip from the half-thawed water-spout in the dull yard behind, not a sigh among the leafless boughs of one despondent poplar, not the idle swinging of an empty storehouse door, no, not a clicking in the fire, but fell upon the heart of Scrooge with a softening influence, and gave a freer passage to his tears. The spirit touched him on the arm, and pointed to his younger self, intent upon his reading. Suddenly, a man in foreign garments, wonderfully real and distinct to look at, stood outside the window, with an axe stuck in his belt, and leading by the bridle an ass laden with wood. "Why, it's Ali Baba!" Scrooge exclaimed in ecstasy. "It's dear old honest Ali Baba. Yes, yes, I know. One Christmas time when yonder solitary child was left here all alone, he did come for the first time, just like that. Poor boy. And Valentine, with his wild brother Orson, there they go. And what's his name, who was put down in his drawers, asleep at the gates of Damascus? Don't you see him? And the Sultan's groom, turned upside down by the genie, there he is upon his head. Serve him right, I'm glad of it. What business had he to be married to the princess?"
So, all of the characters that come to life for young Scrooge here are literary figures. Ali Baba is the most famous today. He was the protagonist of the folktale Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, compiled in 1001 Nights. Ali Baba is a hard-working woodcutter who, with the help of one of his brother's slaves, outwits thieves for treasure. There's an interesting factor in the story that ties into Scrooge's own, as the hero, Ali Baba, marries a woman who is not well off and works for a living. His brother, Kasim, marries a rich woman and lives comfortably without working. Kasim is later killed in his own hunt for the treasure. When Belle breaks up with Scrooge, she says that he used to not care if he and Belle were rich, as long as they had each other. Scrooge, like Ali Baba, was hardworking and in love, but he changed. Valentine and Orson is an old French legend about twin brothers who are left in the woods and brought up in very different ways. Valentine becomes a knight, while Orson is raised by bears. Valentine later learns about his brother, tames him, and makes him his servant. The other references here are much more obscure entries in the 1001 Nights. Scrooge clearly spent a lot of time by himself reading. In the first stave, Dickens says that Scrooge has very little fancy, but it's clear that as a child he very much did.
To hear Scrooge expending all the earnestness of his nature on such subjects in a most extraordinary voice between laughing and crying, and to see his heightened and excited face, would have been a surprise to his business friends in the city, indeed. "There's the parrot!" cried Scrooge. "Green body and yellow tail, with a thing like a lettuce growing out of the top of its head. There he is! Poor Robinson Crusoe, he called him when he came home again after sailing round the island. Poor Robinson Crusoe, where have you been, Robinson Crusoe?" The man thought he was dreaming, but he wasn't. It was the parrot, you know. There goes Friday, running for his life to the little creek. Hallo! Hoop! Hallo!
Obviously, this is a reference to Robinson Crusoe, another character who was abandoned for a long period of time.
Then, with a rapidity of transition very foreign to his usual character, he said, in pity for his former self, "Poor boy," and cried again. "I wish," Scrooge muttered, putting his hand in his pocket and looking about him after drying his eyes with his cuff. "But it's too late now." "What is the matter?" asked the spirit. "Nothing," said Scrooge. "Nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should like to have given him something, that's all." The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved its hand, saying as it did so, "Let us see another Christmas." Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little darker and more dirty. The panels shrunk, the windows cracked, fragments of plaster fell out of the ceiling, and the naked laths were shown instead. But how all of this was brought about, Scrooge knew no more than you do. He only knew that it was quite correct, that everything had happened so, that there he was, alone again, when all the other boys had gone home for the jolly holidays. He was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge looked at the ghost, and with a mournful shaking of his head, glanced anxiously towards the door. It opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in, and put her arms around his neck, and often kissing him, addressed him as her "dear, dear brother." "I have come to bring you home, dear brother," said the child, clapping her tiny hands and bending down to laugh. To bring you home, home, home. Home, little Fan? Returned the boy. Yes, said the child, brimful of glee. Home, for good and all. Home for ever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be, that home's like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed, that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home, and he said yes, you should, and sent me in a coach to bring you. And you're to be a man, said the child, opening her eyes, and are never to come back here, but first we're to be together all Christmas long, and have the merriest time in all the world.
Charles Dickens had a sister named Frances, or Fanny, so this is obviously a shout out to her. Her son Henry is also believed to be the inspiration for Tiny Tim. While both were alive when A Christmas Carol was released, Fanny would die in 1848 at the age of 38, while Henry would die the next year at age 9. Scrooge's father does not appear as a character in the book, so the only description of his change we get is from Fan. A lot of adaptations will run with this and make it clear that Scrooge's father hasn't changed at all, and simply believes Scrooge shouldn't be in school anymore. Also, regardless of whether Scrooge's father did change or not, it's clear that the years when his father was cruel and left him behind at school over Christmas had an awful effect on him. When Scrooge changes at the end, it is clear that he wants to not just be a better person, but to also right the wrongs that he can, which it seems like his father never did. I also think this is the best point to talk about one of the more controversial aspects of the Scrooge character. Ebenezer Scrooge has a first name from the Jewish Bible, a dislike for the most famous Christian holiday, and multiple characteristics that anti Semites use in Jewish stereotypes greed, a pointed nose, etc. Because of this, some assume that Scrooge is intended to be a negative depiction of a Jewish character who is then redeemed by Christianity. However, I think this excerpt from the book is the strongest evidence against that. Fan says that they'll be together all the Christmas long, which makes it clear that the Scrooge family is a Christian one. Additionally, as Oliver Twist makes clear, if Dickens wanted to write a character who was Jewish, he wouldn't exactly be subtle about it. The Fagin character from Oliver Twist is an outright Jewish stereotype and is often referred to in the text as simply, quote, the Jew. Later in life, Dickens did seem to express some regret at characterizing him this way, but this was years after A Christmas Carol was written, too. The fact of the matter is, if Dickens wanted Scrooge to be a Jewish stereotype, he would have been a lot more overt about it.
You're quite a woman, little Fan, exclaimed the boy. She clapped her hands and laughed, and tried to touch his head, but being too little, laughed again, and stood on tiptoe to embrace him. Then she began to drag him, in her childish eagerness, towards the door, and he, nothing loath to go, accompanied her. A terrible voice in the hall cried, "Bring down Master Scrooge's box there!" And in the hall appeared the schoolmaster himself, who glared on Master Scrooge with a ferocious condescension, and threw him into a dreadful state of mind by shaking hands with him. He then conveyed him and his sister into the veriest old well of a shivering best parlour that ever was seen, where the maps upon the wall and the celestial and terrestrial globes in the windows were waxy and cold. Here he produced a decanter of curiously light wine, and a block of curiously heavy cake, and administered installments of those dainties to the young people, at the same time sending out a meagre servant to offer a glass of something to the postboy, who answered that he thanked the gentleman, but if it was the same tap as he had tasted before, he had rather not.
Even here in this little exchange, we note the class disparity between the host boy who comes to get Scrooge and everyone else in the scene. In the text, you'll note that it says get something in quotes for the postboy. They're all having wine and cake, but he is just being offered tap water, and at that, the text makes it clear it's very bad tap water. So even here, we see Dickens' whole message about helping out those who are less fortunate.
Master Scrooge's trunk being by this time tied to the top of the chaise, the children bade the schoolmaster good-bye right willingly, and, getting into it, drove gaily down the garden sweep, the quick wheels dashing the hoar frost and snow off the dark leaves of the evergreens like spray. "Always a delicate creature, whom a breath might have withered," said the ghost. "But she had a large heart." "So she had," cried Scrooge. "You're right. I will not gainsay it, spirit. God forbid." "She died a woman," said the ghost, "and had, as I think, children." "One child," Scrooge returned. "True," said the ghost. "Your nephew." Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind, and answered briefly, "Yes." Although they had but that moment left the school behind them, they were now in the busy thoroughfares of a city, where shadowy passengers passed and repassed, where shadowy carts and coaches battled for the way, and all the strife and tumult of a real city were. It was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops that here, too, it was Christmas time again. But it was evening, and the streets were lighted up. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door, and asked Scrooge if he knew it. "Know it," said Scrooge. "I was apprenticed here." They went in. At sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, sitting behind such a high desk that if he had been 2 inches taller he must have knocked his head against the ceiling, Scrooge cried in great excitement, "Why, it's old Fezziwig! Bless his heart, it's Fezziwig alive again!" Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself from his shoes to his organ of benevolence, and called out in a comfortable, oily, rich, fat, jovial voice, "Yo-ho there! Ebenezer! Dick!"
So the reference to Fezziwig's organ of benevolence is actually a reference to phrenology, a pseudoscience that unfortunately is used by a lot of Nazi, fascist, white supremacist types. However, in the 1840s, it was a much more mainstream kind of belief. We obviously now acknowledge it as a pseudoscience. They believe in phrenology that the shape of your head determines who you are, what your personality will be, things like that. So, since Fezziwig has a big head, it suggests he will be a very benevolent person. That's his organ of benevolence.
Scrooge's former self, now grown a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow prentice. "Dick Wilkins, to be sure," said Scrooge to the ghost. "Bless me, yes, there he is. He was very much attached to me, was Dick. Poor Dick, dear, dear." "Yo-ho, my boys," said Fezziwig. "No more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer." "Let's have the shutters up," cried old Fezziwig, with a sharp clap of his hands, "before a man can say Jack Robinson."
While the meaning of this phrase is obviously quite clear, it has quite an interesting background. There are actually 2 separate phrases regarding speed that include the name Jack Robinson. This one and around Jack Robinson's barn, which has the opposite meaning. If someone had to get around Jack Robinson's barn to get to the point of their story, it's a long-winded one. There have obviously been plenty of people named Jack Robinson, but these expressions don't seem to be in reference to a specific one. The first written record of the first phrase comes from the 1778 novel Evelina by Frances Burney, although she likely did not invent the expression. The around Jack Robinson's barn expression seems to have come later, riffing on the first expression.
You wouldn't believe how fast those 2 fellows went at it. They charged into the street with the shutters. 1, 2, 3. They had 'em up in their places. 4, 5, 6. Barred 'em and pinned 'em. 7, 8, 9. And came back before you could have got to 12, panting like racehorses. "Hilly-ho!" cried old Fezziwig, skipping down from the high desk with wonderful agility. "Clear away, my lads, and let's have lots of room here. Hilly-ho, Dick! Cheer up, Ebenezer!" Clear away! There was nothing they wouldn't have cleared away, or couldn't have cleared away, with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off as if it were dismissed from public life for evermore. The floor was swept and watered, the lamps were trimmed, fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright a ballroom as you would desire to see upon a winter's night.
Like with Scrooge, we're never outright told what Fezziwig's occupation is, but it is clearly something related to Scrooge's. In the 1951 film, his sign says merchants, shippers, and warehousemen, which is admittedly still pretty vague. In The Muppet Christmas Carol, since he's played by Fozzie Bear, he runs a rubber chicken factory. Regardless, he's in a similar line of work to Scrooge, and being reminded of this shows Scrooge that he can make the most of his line of work too.
In came a fiddler with a music book, and went up to the lofty desk, and made an orchestra of it, and tuned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers, whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid with her cousin, the baker. In came the cook with her brother's particular friend, the milkman. In came the boy from over the way, who was suspected of not having board enough from his master, trying to hide himself behind the girl from next door, but one who was proven to have had her ears pulled by her mistress. In they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they came anyhow and everyhow. Away they all went, 20 couple at once, hands half round and back again the other way, down the middle and up again, round and round in various stages of affectionate grouping, old top couple always turning up in the wrong place, new top couples starting off again as soon as they got there. All top couples at last, and not a bottom one to help them.
Dancing. It's still about dancing.
When this result was brought about, old Fezziwig, clapping his hands to stop the dance, cried out, "Well done!" And the fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter, especially provided for that purpose. But scorning rest, upon his reappearance, he instantly began again, though there were no dancers yet, as if the other fiddler had been carried home exhausted on a shutter, and he were the brand-new man resolved to beat him out of sight or perish. There were more dances, and there were forfeits, and more dances, and there was cake, and there was negus, and there was a great piece of cold roast, and there was a great piece of cold boiled, and there were mince pies and plenty of beer.
Negus is a hot mixed drink, including wine, spices, water, and oranges or lemons. As for cold boiled, I've read various opinions on it, and there doesn't seem to be one specific dish called cold boiled. It could simply be any meat that was boiled and then left to sit out until it was cold.
But the great effect of the evening came after the roast and boiled, when the fiddler, an artful dog mind, the sort of man who knew his business better than you or I could have told it him, struck up Sir Roger de Coverley. Then old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig. Top couple, too, with a good stiff piece of work cut out for them, 3 or 4 and 20 pair of partners, people who were not to be trifled with, people who would dance, and had no notion of walking.
Sir Roger de Coverley was a popular English and Scottish country dance of the time. A good number of film adaptations will make sure to include the specific song and dance in their Fezziwig scene, which is always a nice touch. The 1951 film and 1984 films, for example, both have it. Here's a little clip of the song in the 1951 film.
No doubt. Recall it? Why, bless my soul, it's old Fezziwig's.
But if they had been twice as many, 4 times, old Fezziwig would have been a match for them, and so would Mrs. Fezziwig. As to her, she was worthy to be his partner in every sense of the term. If that's not high praise, tell me higher, and I'll use it. A positive light appeared to issue from Fezziwig's calves. They shone in every part of the dance like moons. You couldn't have predicted at any given time what would have become of them next. And when old Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig had gone all through the dance, advance and retire, both hands to your partner, bow and curtsy, corkscrew, thread the needle and back again to your place, Fezziwig cut so deftly that he appeared to wink with his legs and came upon his feet without a stagger. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and, shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired but the 2 prentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds, which were under a counter in the back shop. During the whole of this time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self. He corroborated everything, remembered everything, enjoyed everything, and underwent the strangest agitation. It was not until now, when the bright faces of his former self and Dick were turned from them, that he remembered the ghost, and became conscious that it was looking full upon him, while the light upon its head burnt very clear. "A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude." "Small!" echoed Scrooge. The spirit signed to him to listen to the 2 apprentices, who were pouring out their hearts in praise of Fezziwig, and when he had done so, said, "Why, is it not? He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is that so much that he deserves this praise?" "It isn't that," said Scrooge, heated by the remark, and speaking unconsciously like his former, not his latter self. "It isn't that, spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. Say that his power lies in words and looks, in things so slight and insignificant that it is impossible to add and count 'em up. What then? The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune."
This is a great stepping stone for Scrooge, because he is starting to learn that there's more to life than money. He values what Fezziwig had, even though he didn't spend much money on this, but he is still comparing the value that Fezziwig had to a monetary one. The ghost uses that because it's something Scrooge can understand. He's not all the way there yet, but it is a step along the way.
He felt the spirit's glance and stopped. "What is the matter?" asked the spirit. "Nothing particular," said Scrooge. "Something, I think?" the ghost insisted. "No," said Scrooge. "No. I should like to be able to say a word or 2 to my clerk just now. That's all." His former self turned down the lamps as he gave utterance to the wish, and Scrooge and the ghost again stood side by side in the open air. "My time grows short," observed the spirit. "Quick!" This was not addressed to Scrooge, or to anyone whom he could see, but it produced an immediate effect. For again Scrooge saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of his life. His face had not the harsh and rigid lines of later years, but it had begun to wear the signs of care and avarice. There was an eager, greedy, restless motion in the eye, which showed the passion that had taken root, and where the shadow of the growing tree would fall. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in a mourning dress, in whose eyes there were tears, which sparkled in the light that shone out of the ghost of Christmas past. "It matters little," she said softly. "To you, very little. Another idol has displaced me, and if it can cheer and comfort you in time to come, as I would have tried to, I have no just cause to grieve." "What idol has displaced you?" he rejoined. "A golden one." "This is the even-handed dealing of the world," he said. "There is nothing on which it is so hard as poverty, and there is nothing it professes to condemn with such severity as the pursuit of wealth."
It's interesting that after mentioning the, quote, even-handed dealing of the world, unquote, Scrooge offers a contradiction, saying there is nothing on which it is so hard as poverty, and there is nothing it professes to condemn with such severity as the pursuit of wealth. Immediately after saying that the world is fair, he points out a contradiction which would suggest is not at all. Scrooge is a character of contradictions, and the story often seems happy to point that out. The narrator mentions, as I mentioned in the first part, that Scrooge was never one to make jokes, and we see Scrooge making jokes all throughout.
"You fear the world too much," she answered gently. "All your other hopes have merged into the hope of being beyond the chance of its sordid reproach. I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one, until your master passion, gain, engrosses you. Have I not?" "What then?" he retorted. "Even if I have grown so much wiser, what then? I am not changed towards you." She shook her head. "Am I?" "Our contract is an old one. It was made when we were both poor and content to be so, until, in good season, we could improve our worldly fortune by our patient industry. You are changed. When it was made, you were another man." "I was a boy," he said impatiently. "Your own feeling tells you that you are not what you are," she returned. "I am. That which promised happiness when we were one in heart is fraught with misery now that we are two. How often and how keenly I have thought of this, I will not say. It is enough that I have thought of it, and can release you." "Have I ever sought release?" "In words, no, never." "In what, then?" "In a changed nature, in an altered spirit, in another atmosphere of life, another hope as its great end, in everything that made my love of any worth or value in your sight." "If this had never been between us," said the girl, looking mildly but with steadiness upon him, "tell me you would seek me out and try to win me now." "Ah, no." He seemed to yield to the justice of this supposition in spite of himself, but he said with a struggle, "You think not?" "I would gladly think otherwise if I could," she answered. "Heaven knows, when I have learned a truth like this, I know how strong and irresistible it must be. But if you were free today, tomorrow, yesterday, can even I believe that you would choose a dowerless girl? You, who in your very confidence with her weigh everything by gain, or, choosing her, if for a moment you were false enough to your one guiding principle to do so, do I not know that your repentance and regret would surely follow? I do, and I release you, with a full heart for the love of him you once were."
When Belle calls herself a dowerless girl, she is referring to a wedding dowry. This would be paid by the bride's family to the groom's family. But since Belle was poor, she did not have one and was insecure about this.
He was about to speak, but with her head turned from him, she resumed. "You may. The memory of what is past half makes me hope you will have pain in this. A very, very brief time, and you will dismiss the recollection of it gladly as an unprofitable dream from which it happened well that you awoke. May you be happy in the life you have chosen.
It's interesting that the only scene we get of Belle and Scrooge together is their breakup. We see no happy times between them at all. A lot of adaptations will add scenes of their courtship, often with Scrooge dancing with her at Fezziwig's party. A few even make her Fezziwig's daughter, like the 1970 musical. Regardless, even though Belle hopes Scrooge's pain in this is short, it's clear that the moment still haunts him.
She left him, and they parted. "Spirit," said Scrooge, "show me no more. Conduct me home. Why do you delight to torture me?" "One shadow more," exclaimed the ghost. "No more," cried Scrooge. "No more. I do not wish to see it. Show me no more." But the relentless ghost pinioned him in both arms, and forced him to observe what happened next. They were in another scene and place. A room, not very large or handsome, but full of comfort. Near to the winter fire sat a beautiful young girl, so like the last that Scrooge believed it was the same, until he saw her, now a comely matron, sitting opposite her daughter. The noise in this room was perfectly tumultuous, for there were more children there than Scrooge in his agitated state of mind could count. And, unlike the celebrated herd in the poem, they were not 40 children conducting themselves as one, but every child conducting itself like 40.
This is a reference to the William Wordsworth poem Written in March. The first half of it goes as follows. The cock is crowing, the stream is flowing, the small birds twitter, the lake doth glitter, the green field sleeps in the sun, the oldest and youngest are at work with the strongest, the cattle are grazing, their heads never raising, there are 40 feeding like one. Instead of something smooth and full of unity, the children in Belle's home are all being energetic in their own way, but it's a delight nonetheless.
The consequences were uproarious beyond belief, and no one seemed to care. On the contrary, the mother and daughter laughed heartily and enjoyed it very much. And the latter, soon beginning to mingle in the sports, got pillaged by the young brigands most ruthlessly. What would I not have given to be one of them? Though I never could have been so rude, no, I wouldn't for the wealth of all the world have crushed that braided hair and torn it down. And for the precious little shoe, I wouldn't have plucked it off, God bless my soul, to save my life. As to measuring her waist in sport as they did, bold young brood, I couldn't have done it. I should have expected my arm to have grown round it for a punishment, and never come straight again. And yet I should have dearly liked, I own, to have touched her lips, to have questioned her, that she might have opened them, to have looked upon the lashes of her downcast eyes, and never raised a blush, to have let loose those waves of hair, an inch of which would be a keepsake beyond price. In short, I should have liked, I do confess, to have the lightest license of a child, and yet to have been man enough to know its value.
Yeah, so I like almost all of Dickens' asides and colorful word choice throughout this book, but I'll admit this is a bit creepy. I feel like there's a way to say I'd like to have the mind of a child again and, just leave it there. Also, it seems like he's fantasizing about being her brother. If you take just the last bit of that paragraph by itself, I think you could defend it. I should have liked, I do confess, to have had the lightest license of a child, and yet to have been man enough to know its value. We all look back on times in our childhood and wish we knew how important something would be. Maybe the last time with a grandparent or just a really special day. That said, in this context, it's nothing more than wishing he could have childlike innocence, but adult awareness about a young girl, so yeah, it's pretty bad.
But now a knocking at the door was heard, and such a rush immediately ensued that she, with laughing face and plundered dress, was borne towards it the centre of a flushed and boisterous group. just in time to greet the father, who came home attended by a man laden with Christmas toys and presents. Then the shouting and the struggling and the onslaught that was made on the defenseless porter. The scaling him with chairs for ladders to dive into his pockets, despoil him of brown paper parcels, hold on tight by his cravat, hug him round his neck, pommel his back, and kick his legs in irrepressible affection. The shouts of wonder and delight at which the development of every package was received. The terrible announcement that the baby had been taken in the act of putting a doll's frying pan into his mouth, and was more than suspected of having swallowed a fictitious turkey glued on a wooden platter. The immense relief of finding this a false alarm. The joy and gratitude and ecstasy, they were all indescribable alike. It is enough that by degrees the children and their emotions got out of the parlor, and by one stair at a time up to the top of the house, where they went to bed, and so subsided. And now Scrooge looked on more attentively than ever, when the master of the house, having his daughter leaning fondly on him, sat down with her and her mother at his own fireside. And when he thought that such another creature, quite as graceful and as full of promise, might have called him father, and been a springtime in the haggard winter of his life, his sight grew very dim indeed. "Belle," said the husband, turning to his wife with a smile, "I saw an old friend of yours this afternoon. Who was it? Guess." "How can I? Tut, don't I know?" she added in the same breath, laughing as he laughed. "Mr. Scrooge!" Mr. Scrooge it was! I passed his office window, and as it was not shut up, and he had a candle inside, I could scarcely help seeing him. His partner lies upon the point of death, I hear, and there he sat alone. Quite alone in the world, I do believe.
This scene is kind of an outlier in the Christmas Past sequence, as it doesn't really have Scrooge in it. It has this reference to him, but he doesn't actually appear. It shows Scrooge what could have been, and it contrasts Belle's thriving life with Scrooge's as it was falling apart. A few adaptations opt to have scenes of Scrooge's love interest in the present instead of this scene in the past.
"Spirit," said Scrooge in a broken voice, "remove me from this place." "I told you these were shadows of the things that have been," said the ghost, "that they are what they are. Do not blame me." "Remove me!" Scrooge exclaimed. "I cannot bear it." He turned upon the ghost, and seeing that it looked upon him with a face in which some strange way there were fragments of all the faces it had shown him, wrestled with it. "Leave me! Take me back! Haunt me no longer!" In the struggle, if that can be called a struggle in which the ghost, with no visible resistance on its own part, was undisturbed by any effort of its adversary, Scrooge observed that its light was burning high and bright, and dimly connecting that with its influence over him, he seized the extinguisher cap, and by a sudden action pressed it down upon its head. The spirit dropped beneath it, so that the extinguisher covered its whole form. But, though Scrooge pressed it down with all his force, he could not hide the light, which streamed from under it in an unbroken flood upon the ground.
No matter how hard he tries to stop it, the light of the past still shines. Again, it's like Scrooge is snuffing out a candle here. However, despite Scrooge's preference for darkness, this light is not going away.
He was conscious of being exhausted and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness, and, further, of being in his own bedroom. He gave the cap a parting squeeze, in which his hand relaxed, and had barely time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. End of Stave 2.
So, that is the end of the Ghost of Christmas Past portion of the story, the second stave. So, it ended up being just one episode. It was one of those where it could be two considerably shorter episodes, or just one slightly longer one. Longer than the two previous ones in this series, and I just decided to keep it as one because there's, I would imagine, less to say about the past than there is about the coming present stave. I have a lot that I foresee I'll be covering in that episode, so I imagine that one's going to be broken into two. But I don't have everything written out yet except in my head, so we will see next month as to whether it's just the first part of Christmas Present or both. But for now, that's where we are. So, yeah, if you've seen only adaptations and not read the book, I think there's a lot here that might surprise you, as I said at the beginning of the episode. The description of the Ghost of Christmas Past is just wild. Not really anything else in the book like it, as a lot of people have pointed out. And yeah, it's very kind of psychedelic almost. So Dickens definitely has something very unique in mind when he wrote that. I like it. I think it works for how we view the past. But yeah, it's a little out there. Just the changing shape and changing form and everything else. And I'm glad that most adaptations don't try to do that because I don't think it would look good. In live action, it's just going to be distracting. I think it's best that most go for a more simplified version. Sometimes it's just, a person with bright hair and they emit some light, perhaps. I'm okay with that. The animated ones that go for it, I can appreciate a bit more. I think the Richard Williams one does it really well. I think the Richard Williams one does pretty much everything really well because it's a love letter to the book in the best kind of way. So, yeah, the Jim Carrey one with the Robert Zemeckis film where Jim Carrey plays Scrooge and all the ghosts tries to do this too, which I can appreciate, but there's some things when we get there that I don't like about that portrayal. That's not something we need to talk about right now, but yeah, there's things about that portrayal of the ghost and those scenes that I really don't like in that movie, but at least it goes for it. So, that's interesting. There are only a few that do. And what I think is interesting about the book compared to the adaptations is each of these scenes in the past are pretty much just snippets. Some will get expanded on in certain adaptations, others get expanded on in other adaptations. It's really just a matter of what an adaptation wants to focus on. Here, we get the idea that just all of these things made Scrooge who he is, being left alone at school, and then the time that his sister came to take him, and then the time that he was at Fezziwig's, and then the breakup with Belle. Like, these are all little snippets of who Scrooge is, obviously. And a lot of versions will narrow their focus. They might have all of these scenes, but they'll expand on the certain ones that they think are most important to Scrooge's development. In other cases, they'll even add scenes like the Alistair Sim film, which add a whole bunch of scenes of Scrooge's business life. We see him originally more like Mr. Fezziwig, and then he kind of falls away into the new model of the Industrial Revolution with Mr. Jorkins. That's kind of what makes Scrooge who he is in that version. It's the changing world and new ideas of business that change him. While there are other versions that really show that it's the breakup with Belle that hardens his heart into the Scrooge we know. And in all of those movies, it's still money too. There's never one where the love of money isn't what's hurting him, but a lot of times they'll say, "Oh, the breakup with Belle, that was the final piece in the puzzle to make him who he was, because she was a good balance for him." The 1970 musical really focuses on that, and I really like the past sequences in that film. I think they narrowed their focus well. I talked about this in my season 1 wrap up too, but I find it really interesting just how each adaptation can kind of pick its own focus. And that's why I don't think just adapting every scene verbatim is a great adaptation choice. That's barely an adaptation, that's just a visual of the book. I'd like to see a little bit of focus and narrative decisions of here's what we think made Scrooge who he is, or here's who made our Scrooge what he is. And yeah, there's even one or two that focus on the loss of his sister as a big driving force, which is really interesting because she's not all that major of a character in the book. But yeah, I like that each can kind of do its own thing. Not every film does the past scenes well, some do it very poorly. But yeah, in the book, we just get these little snippets, and almost no adaptations cover the part where Scrooge sees those literary characters coming to life. That just seems to be a little tribute to the way literature can come alive when you're, especially when you're little, and it really truly comes to life. It's like you're living it, and the characters literally step out of the book for Scrooge. It's a nice little scene. I like it a lot. But yeah, sure. I get why it's not included, especially because in the more realistic movies, I realize it's a ghost story, but in the more realistic looking ones, it might look a little bit silly if characters started stepping out of books. But I think there are versions that reference that scene in a nice way, at least. Again, I'm not the biggest fan of the scene with Belle and her husband, but I don't outright dislike it. Like, I understand why Dickens has it there, right? It's here's what you could have had. I think that's implied regardless, so I understand why a lot of movies cut it. However, in my mind, that is always a major part of the story, and I realize that's because the play I grew up going to year after year in my local theater included that scene. So I don't remember every specific detail of that play's adaptation, but I do remember it had that scene because I can always remember them doing the, "Oh, I saw an old friend of yours in the city today." So to me, that's always a really important scene to the story, just in the back of my brain, even though I realize the more adaptations I see and revisit, most of them don't really keep that scene. And when I think about it logically, I'm like, yeah, I'm okay with that. I get it. But yeah, in the back of my brain, that's always been kind of an important scene just because the play I went to had it. The 1951 film has his love interest in the present day helping people in poverty. And yeah, I like that. I think that's a good take on her character because she's kind of fulfilling who she wanted to become when she broke up with Scrooge. I think the George C. Scott one has a more straight take on the scene that works too without that weird sexualizing stuff of the sister. Like, bad choice, Dickens. Sorry. Just stuff has been written on that. I think there was a tweet thread a while back, maybe an article written about it, but you can look that up and read what some people have said about that. It's just not a well written portion of the book. There's not really a way around it. I kind of get what he's going for, but don't love it. Just say you could like to be a child again without, sexualizing a teenage girl, presumably. Yeah, so everything else here, though, I really like the way it's written. I love the description of the dance, even though I made some jokes about it, but that's such just it you get right into the feel of the party. It's great. So, yeah, that is the Ghost of Christmas Past stave, the first of the three spirits. Hope you learned a little something or remembered some things you hadn't thought about in a while. Leave me comments. What are your favorite versions of this part of the story? Who's your favorite Ghost of Christmas Past? A lot of my favorites are actually yet to come. No pun intended. Some of my favorite Ghosts of Christmas Past are in versions we haven't talked about yet. For the ones we have talked about, often it's the kind of offbeat ones. It's not the traditional adaptations. I really like Steve Lawrence in Carol for Another Christmas, and I really like David Wayne in An American Christmas Carol. Otherwise, the best I say about a lot of these adaptations is they do okay because it's such a vague ghost that when you adapt it, it often comes out a little cold. I kind of like the one in the Alistair Sim film, kind of a Father Time thing. I do like the sort of prim and proper, but a little sarcastic woman in the Albert Finney one. She's enjoyable. But yeah, there's a lot of times where this character, if you adapt it somewhat traditionally, maybe not in appearance, but in dialogue, it comes off a little underwhelming. So, both of the 1930s ones, for example, I'm not a big fan of those portrayals. But yeah, there's plenty of ones to come in particular that I think really get that character in an interesting way. So, we'll be talking about those in the future. But next month, we will be talking about The Ghost of Christmas Present. And even more so than the past, I think if you only know adaptations, there are a lot of parts of this you might not be as familiar with that are quite interesting. It's not just a scene at the Cratchits and a scene at Fred's, which are what a lot of adaptations do. So we will talk about that next month. It might be a two-parter, so it might just be the first half next month, but we'll see. Scrooge, a Christmas Carol podcast, is written, edited, and hosted by Collin. Theme music is Christmas Day by TRG Banks. The LibriVox audiobook in this episode is A Christmas Carol read by Kyle Munley, and the other clip I used is from Scrooge 1951. Leaving a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing on YouTube will be a big help to me. I'll be back next month with another episode of Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. Until then, make sure to live in the past, the present, and the future, and ensure that the spirits of all three strive within you.